Hi, everyone. Okay, shall we give it one more minute? Let's see.
Sure, just let me get that.
Yeah. I think I'll just get us started. How's that? Because I'm aware it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and many of our friends may have to go to work or maybe at work. Thank you so much for all being here. Uh, Today's talk is very special. It's the Allied victory traveling through World War II China. Hi, everyone. 我叫张梅. My name's Mei Zhang, and I'm the founder of WildChina. I'll just briefly speak a little bit why we have today's events, and I'll introduce two of our speakers, and then we'll roll on with some storytelling, very exciting storytelling. So this year marks the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Pacific theater of World War II. And to honor this milestone, WildChina partnered with the Royal Asiatic Society Beijing, which I'm going to refer to as RAS Beijing from here on, to create journeys to really travel through these pivotal events, both physically and intellectually. And so today is one of those events that will visit these events here in this room. And later on, if you're interested in physically visiting these events, come and travel with us. Melinda and Alan will be with us on the trips. So today, we will talk about two events. One is the Doolittle Raiders and the Flying Tigers. These two are both iconic groups whose bravery and collaboration between the American and the Chinese people really left very, very important legacy on the World War II history. These stories are not just really war stories. They really are stories about human connections. And I think in today's geopolitical environment, we sorely need this connection. So for this reason alone, I am extremely grateful that everyone's here, paying attention, learning, having a dialogue about making connections. So whether you're joining from China, US, or anywhere else in the world, we thank you. And we hope to make this hour meaningful. And just quickly, the flow of today's event, we'll watch a quick 5-minute video to set the scene of the Doolittle event, Raiders. And then Melinda, two of our speakers, will give a presentation about those two events. Melinda will talk about the Doolittle Raiders, and Alan will talk about the Flying Tigers. Now, who are they? These two wonderful speakers, many of you probably already know. First speaker, Melinda Liu. I'll briefly say a few things. Melinda brings a really unique perspective on US-China relations. I think she's been in China for over 30 years, right? In any event, Melinda's sort of her connection with China is also shaped by her remarkable family history and her decades experience as a journalist involved with China. Born and educated in the US, Melinda has lived and worked in China for nearly 30 years, serving as Newsweek's Beijing bureau chief. Her passion for preserving this shaped history has led her to help establish the Doolittle Raider Memorial Hall in Quzhou. And she also co-directed documentary films like Doolittle Raiders, A China Story, and also advises Yunnan's Flying Tigers Research Association. So through her work, Melinda illuminates the intertwined history of the US and China during World War II, bridging past sacrifices with present understanding. The other speaker, Alan. I'm delighted to introduce Alan Babington-Smith. Alan brings with him a wealth of professional knowledge and personal connections to this discussion, thanks to his roles as the founder of the Royal Asiatic Society Beijing, RAS Beijing. Alan has lived and worked as a banker across the globe, including the UK, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Poland, and the Baltics. He has called China home since 2000, and his deep appreciation for history is rooted in his family's own remarkable World War II legacy. And I think, Alan, I'm going to let you address on some of the details there. And Alan's dedication to preserving these stories and his passion for connecting people through history also make him an invaluable voice in today's discussion. And one thing you'll find out is both of our speakers are personally linked to these events. But I will let them tell the story. So please join me welcome Melinda and Alan. All right, I think I'm going to move on with the program, and let's take a few minutes to watch the 5-minute short video before I bring Melinda on.
In this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes.
听说美国的这个飞行员现在降下来的时候，在一家老百姓家里门口，很早的躺在门那个大门前，老百姓开门到菜地里去啊，一看这么两个人，眼睛是红红的，头发是这样子的，好像这个人不知道什么地方来的，大家有点怕，但是出于老百姓的同情。
Just 1 second. I'm sorry, Shirley. Is it just my end? I can't see the video. I just want to check.
I can't see it either.
Nor can I.
I
There
think
we
we
go.
need to
Okay.
restart it. Yeah. There we go. That should be it.
Okay.
In this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes.
"听说美国的这个飞行员现在降下来的时候，在一家老百姓家里门口，很早的躺在门那个大门前，老百姓开门到菜地里去啊，一看这么两个人，眼睛是红红的，头发是这样子的，好像这个人不知道什么地方来的，大家有点怕，但是出于老百姓的同情，请他到家里去喝茶、吃早饭，他都不喝。他警惕性很高，这个煮给他鸡蛋啊，他就一口一口的吃了。
这是一个巨大的石头山的山洞，这是当时的第13航空总站的防空洞。当年杜立特的突袭者就曾经在这里躲避日本空袭的突袭。工作人员曾经在这里铺了一些行军床，让杜立特突袭者在这里休息。有些人呢会开始抱怨糟糕的他吃不惯的中国食物，会使劲的喊要牛奶要糖。我们可以看到洞口刻着2个英文的姓名 Fitzhugh 和 Radney。现在我们能够确认这个地方就是当年杜立特突袭者曾经生活过的地方。
The Raiders succeeded in bombing Tokyo April 18, 1942, but a terrible price was paid. 15 crews had to bail out or crash land in China in Japanese-occupied territory. 8 raiders were captured by the Japanese. Of these 8, 3 were executed. 1 died of malnutrition in a POW camp. 64 raiders were helped by ordinary Chinese people to hide from the Japanese soldiers and travel hundreds of miles across China to safety. Over 250,000 Chinese people died at the hands of the Japanese military for helping the raiders. The raiders have carried this burden on their back for the rest of their lives.
On behalf of the Doolittle Raiders, we thank you for helping us rescue us when we were lost, tired, hungry, and hunted by the Japanese troops.
那时候我们中国很苦的，老百姓也没有办法，不是说我们中国是东亚病夫啊，所以国家经济差就不能，现在就不能够讲，不能够讲就受人欺负啊。那时候美国人还是帮助我们的啊，空军啊什么。我们中美还是有合作，还是在和平。
Thank you. Thank you all. This is just a great teaser to get us started. Melinda, why don't we turn the floor over to you and hear from you, both the historical event and your connection to the event. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mei. Alan and I are really honored to be here speaking with you today, and also especially to have been invited by WildChina to curate these tours that are coming up this year. Okay, so why on earth should I, as a foreign correspondent in Beijing, have any interest in World War II Western aviators? In fact, this has been a kind of a pet project or even passion of mine for a long time. One could say that the connection goes back all the way to my childhood, because in this photo you'll see, this is it shows a group of Americans and Chinese together. The Americans are from the crew number 2 of the Doolittle Raiders, who had crash landed in China in April 1942, and spoke no Chinese, knew nobody, didn't know exactly where they were, and were being chased by the Japanese, who wanted very desperately to capture them. So my father is actually one of the 2 Chinese in the picture, and he's the one in the white suit. It's always been a mystery to me how he kept such a nice white suit in the middle of a war, but never mind. He happened to be in that little town waiting to be smuggled to free China in Western China, and by accident was asked by local Chinese to come help them because he could speak Chinese. He had no idea what was going on. He was pushed into a room, and there were these 5 Americans, muddy, disheveled, scared, hungry, unshaven, uniforms all in a mess, and not understanding anything that was going on. And so he jumped in as their translator, and also being a patriotic Chinese, he decided to stay with them, help their compatriots, the other aviators who were in similar situations all over China, and help them get to Chongqing, the wartime capital. And so that's a story that's been with me since I was born. That's why I've continued with this passion and spent a lot of time researching this topic in China. Next slide, please. So this is a slide about then and now. 1942, you saw this picture of these Doolittle Raiders outside, basically a cave that had been used as an air raid shelter in 1942, and they spent a lot of time in that air raid shelter. Weirdly, it had once been a sort of Buddhist retreat, but it was big. It could hold a lot of people. That was 1942. Then in 2018, I started helping children and grandchildren of Doolittle Raiders come to China. And in this particular group on the right-hand side, 2 grandsons came to China and met the family of Chinese who had rescued their grandfather. And so we went to the grandfather's landing site where he landed by parachute, and we raised a toast, thanking the Chinese and being together for the first time. Next slide, please. So this sort of grassroots encounter, became a pet project of mine. I helped a number of groups come to China, and also helped them kind of understand kind of the other China that many tourists don't often see, down in the countryside, in cities that nobody's heard of before. But in this case, there were villages, cities, entire areas where the story of the Doolittle Raiders was well known. Through educational programs, through bringing families together, children of aviators getting together with the children of the Chinese who saved those aviators, and also just commemorative ceremonies. We saw an amazing blossoming of friendships among very unlikely people. Some of the children of the Doolittle Raiders were from Middle America, never traveled before, and suddenly they were in a rather remote part of Zhejiang province. It was a great way to enhance understanding at the grassroots among ordinary people. Next slide, please. And then we noticed that Chinese authorities and Chinese residents themselves were actually paying a lot of attention to this shared history. And one good example is what had been a very rundown missionary hospital built by British missionaries more than 100 years ago. And as you saw in the video, it had sheltered some of the Doolittle Raiders. And that was a crew that was very badly injured. And a Chinese doctor and an American doctor operated on the pilot of that plane, crew number 7, and saved his life basically by amputating his leg. He survived. He wrote an Oscar-winning a book which became an Oscar-winning film called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo about the raid. And to our surprise, Alan and I went there almost 10 years ago now, and discovered that it had been immaculately restored. It was a museum. It talked a lot about the Doolittle Raiders. The local people were very proud of it. And how did they it was restored to the way it looked in 1942. How did they know how it looked in 1942? Because it had fallen into disrepair. They watched the movie, and so they recreated all those scenes in real life. This is the built heritage of 1942. And you can still go there and visit this place. It's a little museum. Next slide, please. This preservation of built heritage is very important because, as you know, China's undergoing breakneck modernization and tearing down a lot of buildings that are either just too old, maybe dangerous, and in very poor condition. It actually costs less to build a new building than it costs to restore an old building in poor condition. But this story, I'm so thrilled that it was saved and retold at the museum, Enza Clinic Museum it's called, because it also is a legend in America, having been made into a film and made into and become part of a book. So 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, for those old film buffs among you, that's an interesting one to look at. You can see the real clinic if you come to China. Next slide, please. The film that you saw was actually made in 2017. And what I'm telling you now is pretty much an update of some amazing things that have happened since then. In 2018, the small city of Quzhou in Zhejiang actually built and opened a museum to the Doolittle Raid. They call it a memorial hall because it's not quite as big as what a museum should be, but it's astounding. And then last year it was doubled in size because it had been given great importance by local officials and even national level officials. It was mentioned by Chinese President Xi Jinping on his trip to San Francisco. We will see that also if you come to China. It's remarkable, very well captioned with bilingual captions. Next slide, please. And then at very low levels, or even just kind of grassroots levels of Chinese society, we noticed that there were smaller memorials popping up because people want to remember this history. And so this is an example. One Doolittle Raider, while bailing out of his aircraft over China, did not survive the bailout, and his corpse was found by Chinese villagers on a mountainside. They actually protected the remains of this Doolittle Raider named Leland Factor. Apparently wild animals were trying to get at it. They saved him, and they buried him near Quzhou. And he lay there for a while, and then his remains were repatriated to the US before 1949. But the locals remembered where that first grave was. They remembered, some people had seen the gravestone, and many of them witnessed the repatriation. And so last year also, they erected a small new black stone marker and laid flowers on it and made a small, like a little park there. And this was all very grassroots. It's a remarkable and very touching story. Next slide, please. The other thing that I've noticed in recent years is that younger Chinese are expressing more and more interest in this World War II history, in the Americans who were in China during the war. And one of the example of these young people is this young man who's on the left side of the screen holding the framed artifact. He's in his mid-30s, and yet he has, with great perseverance and passion, collected thousands and thousands of photographs of World War II China, many of them including Americans and other Westerners in them. And his collection is getting a higher and a higher profile. He is putting up exhibitions, and recently had one at the American Embassy in Beijing. His name is WWII, and he has great ambitions to use these old photographs to further China's understanding with other countries. Next slide, please. Okay, now the Doolittle Raiders, I wanted to spend some time talking about them, not only because of my personal passion, but also because they're not that well known in China. For many Chinese, the name Flying Tigers is the name that not only is remembered, some of them call all Western aviators who were in World War II China Flying Tigers. In fact, there were different groups, as Mei mentioned, and you'll hear about a couple of the others in Alan's upcoming presentation. The story of the Flying Tigers and the Hump pilots, who are the third group, is very intertwined. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other. And so over to Alan for his presentation, and thank you very much. Thank you, Mei.
Thank you, Melinda. Fascinating story. Alan, before I turn it over to you, just a quick, I just want to ask Melinda, did you ever ask your father, did you see that photo of him wearing a white suit when you were little, or you found it later?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had seen it, but it didn't make much. Okay, when I saw it, it was like a kind of a tattered and black and white photo. The version that you saw in the title page of the PowerPoint was colorized. And as a child, it didn't actually have much impact on me. Okay, maybe everyone feels this way when you're young, or you're even a young adult in your 20s, and you're talking with your parents. You kind of feel like you're always going to have this chance. They're always around. You're always going to have this chance to talk with them, and you don't act. My biggest regret is that I never interviewed him as a journalist should have interviewed him. I sometimes sat down and talked with him. I sometimes even recorded it, but I never did a real oral history approach with him. And so I knew a lot of things, but they're fragmentary. They're sort of disjointed, like this photograph on the screen now. I've been trying to find that place. And I've been trying to find out the identity of that other Chinese guy in there. And there are different stories about who it might be. And the place, we think we found it where it had been, but of course it's now been destroyed. So there's still many, many mysteries about this story, even related to my own father, that I have not solved yet. But I did see that photo, but literally there are only about 3 or 4 photos from the war that has my father in it that I had been familiar with when I was younger. I'm looking for more now. And of course, that's why I'm really interested in Chinese photographs, because there could be a repository here, maybe even WWII has some of them that have pictures that we've never seen before.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll lesson to us all. If you're interested in talking to your parents, start now.
Good lesson.
Alan, over to you. Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Good morning from Beijing. As Mei said, we're going to, in this total talk, we're covering both the Doolittle Raiders, who operated in East China. And now I'm going to ask you to shift your view to West China, where at the time the Doolittle Raiders attacked Tokyo in April 1942, China had already been at war with Japan, remember, for nearly 5 years. And the invasion of China from the west started just at the same time as Pearl Harbor. And you can see on this map where Japan, how far north Japan had already occupied and was poised to invade China completely from the west. More importantly, the Japanese occupation of Burma, as it was then called, cut off what had been the only supply line into West China, the Burma Road. And so it became very obvious that if China was going to receive any support from the Western allies, principally Britain and USA, of course, they would have to be flown in. And so at the time that that was being planned, also it became clear that the Japanese Air Force operating out of South China and out of Burma had a free hand in West China to bomb freely the operating capital of China, Chongqing, in the west of China, and of course any military formations. So fairly early on, if you can go to the next slide, please, the Chinese government, and you can see Chiang Kai-shek there in the middle, smiling broadly, engaged an American flyer called Claire Chenot, who you see standing there very erectly, basically to raise a branch of the Chinese military. Chenot, looked around and found some 99 flyers to form this band of mercenaries operating as part of the Chinese armed forces. They were a mixed bunch, as you'd expect with any mercenaries, and their planes gradually evolved, and this is the famous P-40 that they used throughout their attacks. And Chenot licked them into shape pretty quietly. The first engagement in December 1941, which was only about 2 months after this formation had been created, knocked out 75 Japanese planes for the loss of only 6 of their own. At the time, that was an astonishing victory. It took the Japanese completely by surprise, put them on the back foot. At the time, Winston Churchill compared the deeds of these flying tigers to the Battle of Britain pilots in the sense of the scale of their success. They operated as an independent unit under the name of the Flying Tigers for about 9 months. And here you will see that there was very close collaboration between the Americans and the Chinese in making the whole operation effective. You will see in the next slide how the Chinese worked in huge numbers to make possible landing fields. Simply, there you are, a few thousand Chinese pulling a huge concrete roller to make a runway. A very striking feature of the Doolittle Raiders, of course, is their name and their insignia. Even Claire Chenot himself really says that he had no idea how it was that the term Flying Tigers was created, or that how that shark-nosed P-40 became the symbol. But anyway, it did, and it is, as Melinda has said, the Flying Tigers stand for the great air collaboration between the Chinese and the Americans in the World War. And Chenot himself said of them, "It is my fondest hope that the sign of the Flying Tiger will remain aloft just as long as it is needed, and it will always be remembered on both shores of the Pacific as the symbol of two great peoples working towards a common goal in war and peace." That was the Flying Tigers. Operating and supporting them was the Hump. Now, the Hump is much less well known and much less glamorous and didn't have quite the insignia, but it was a very remarkable operation and equally gallant. It was a support operation, ferrying mostly fuel from what was then British India into China. And it was an appalling operation technically, because the route was completely uncharted. They were flying without instruments in horrible conditions. The tempestuous weather over the Himalayas made flying extremely hazardous. And the losses were appalling. They reckon they lost some 600 aircraft on that route. They flew more than 500,000 flights and eventually involved 80,000 people And here you see some of the men being ferried in what is basically a very, very stripped out civilian aircraft. And the number of crashes was appalling. You could say that is what happened. And the number of crashes were so appalling that the route they flew was known colloquially by the pilots as the aluminium trail, because those were the points of reference. Now, there's a strange kicker to this story, that the very first Hump flight made in April 1942 was to carry fuel to the Doolittle Raiders. You remember, Melinda said, they were supposed to bomb Tokyo, fly to China, land in China, and then the planes were going to be at the disposal of the Chinese Air Force to attack the Japanese. As Melinda explained, all their planes crashed. But it is an astonishing coincidence that the very first Hump flight was there to provide fuel to the Doolittle Raiders. There is also a very peculiar personal link that I have to this story. None of my relations were involved in the Pacific War at all. But it did turn out that the Enza Hospital that Melinda referred to was actually built by someone who was a relation of mine. He was called Babington, and he was a British missionary doctor who came to China in 1900 and ended up at Linhai, where he ran the Enza clinic for nearly 20 years. So when I went the first time to the Enza clinic with Melinda, we had an extraordinary experience because we traveled with the son of one of the Doolittle Raiders who had come to visit the site associated with his father. And we went into the Enza clinic, which none of us had seen before. And there in the main museum room were 3 photographs. One of the father of the Doolittle Raider, one of Melinda's father, and one of my relation. It was quite extraordinary, a spine-chilling moment. And I can't guarantee that anyone joining the trip will have exactly those sensations, but it is going to be an amazing trip. And I hope our little presentation has enlivened it for you and encourage you all to come. You're going to see some amazing places, meet very special people, and to get a real insight into one of the lesser known aspects of World War II in a very important year. Thank you. We're going to show this film. This was a film, British news film, Over the Hump, which I think speaks of it much more loudly than I have. Let's hear it.
Royal Air Force history has been made in the supplying of China's armies by the long and hazardous route over the Hump. From airfields in India, heavily laden Dakotas make their pioneering treks over uncharted territory across the eastern ranges of the Himalayas. The awesome majesty of mountains rising often to 20,000 feet and more is a challenge to the courage of men and the perfection of their machines. The heavy monsoon cloud, which reduces visibility to a minimum during the heat of the day, adds to the dangers of flying. Below here, airstrips are unknown, and to seek for a flat surface to land would be a hopeless task. Field Marshal Wavell once said, "Supply is the greatest of all the problems of the war against Japan." Here, not only distance, but climate and the mountain mass which the ancients named the backbone of the world are the enemy. By bridging this barrier, air supply routes help to unshackle the virtually untapped manpower of China's millions. Tires, petrol, oil, ammunition, and perhaps the greatest need of all, medical supplies, flow into Kunming by a British lifeline. Allied victories in Burma will not only open the road to Mandalay, they are also making possible easier air routes to China. With the swelling flood of war supplies, Chinese armies will for once meet the Japanese on equal terms. British and American airmen of Transport Command are the pioneers of this Burma road in the sky.
Amazing stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, I can't tell you, Melinda and Alan, the sense of like, all these movies or photographs, when you just see them in a museum, they sort of they're so distant. But in this room is like through the two of you, your personal blood relatives are directly tied to these histories that make, just bring them so much more personal and meaningful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, just for everyone in the room, I know quite a few of you are history buffs. Some of you know aviation history really quite well. So if you have any questions, I think, Shirley, can we unmute them to ask questions or type in chat? I guess either one works, right? So take the time. You want to comment on this, Shirley? What's the best way to ask questions?
Yeah, you can type in the chat box if you have any questions.
Great. Type in the chat box would be the best. And take your time and let me kick off with a few questions, the privilege of the host, some of the questions that's on my mind. Do you know why those names? Why is the one called Doolittle Raid and the other one of the Flying Tigers, while the airplanes were actually painted sharks? Do we know?
Well,
Linda, you go first.
yeah, I can add, I'll take the easy question. I can answer why the mission in April 1942 was called the Doolittle Raid. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so Doolittle was Jimmy Doolittle. He was a legendary aviator in America, not only for his military achievements, but he was actually very well educated. He also, in the corporate world, he also had jobs in with corporations, big companies, and he in his personal background, he had done barnstorming. I mean, he'd flown tiny little planes across huge parts of America, and he was chosen to lead this secret mission by the White House. And part of the reason why, I think, is because he was just an extraordinarily intelligent, brave, and organized aviator. And motivating. He was extremely popular with his team. And there were 80 Doolittle Raiders that trained for the mission. They were told it was a secret mission to begin with. They were volunteers. They actually were told that it could end up being a suicide mission, and it almost was. They had to make wills before they took off. It was that dangerous. And one of the reasons why the Doolittle Raiders kind of stands out a lot in aviation history, in addition to the strategic ramifications. Okay, strategically, the Japanese were on a roll in the Pacific at the time. They were taking over cities right and left, islands right and left, and the Doolittle Raid was one bit of good news that lifted morale in the U.S., number one. So that was helpful, but also it shocked the Japanese because they had never been invaded in their homeland, meaning the home island, since the Mongols' time, hundreds of years. And so they had to then shift a lot of their resources to defending themselves, figuring out how vulnerable were they at home. And so that some of the resources that might have been used for aggression and offense were used for defense. And then the final thing is it sort of, the Doolittle Raid sort of solidified or encouraged a World War II obsession with carrier warfare, aircraft carriers, because the Doolittle Raiders, one of the reasons that they were so surprising for the Japanese is they flew land-based bombers. B-25s are heavy bomber aircraft that normally would take off from land at a runway. But they took off from the USS Hornet, which was an aircraft carrier, which of course is a very limited runway. And the way that they practiced was they were told, okay, your runway is now only this big and this long, and you got to be off the ground or you're going to end in the ocean by the end of it. And that's how they practiced. So that was an innovation. They went ahead with it. And there were other kind of creative aspects to what the Raiders did as well. The airplanes had to be adapted so they could carry more fuel. It was still not quite enough, but so it was an example of bravery, organization, motivation, charisma, and also innovation that I think in the American military, at least, gave Doolittle such a big profile. That's why it was called the Doolittle Raiders. Okay, now Alan, over to you for the Flying Tigers.
Yeah, the question of why they're called the Flying Tigers and what the link is with the shark. It was a mystery to everybody at the time. Claire Chennault didn't understand why the shark and the Flying Tiger were put together. Some of the planes did have, Disney did make a Flying Tiger emblem that was used by some of the pilots some of the time. But the shark, they reckon, actually was copied from some of the planes used by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which the British then adopted when they used P-40s in North Africa, which they'd been using for a year before the Flying Tigers came in. Of course, the Flying Tigers only lasted 9 months. So the Flying Tiger symbol didn't stay on the planes for very long, but the shark stayed on the planes. And indeed, it is still used on the latest version of the American fighter called the A-10 ground attack jets. They still keep that shark. And I think they don't have to call themselves the Flying Tigers, but they keep the shark.
Wow. So I don't know if I mentioned to you this, Alan, before. My grandmother used to tell me stories. She's long past, but she would talk about in Kunming, the siren goes off and they would duck to hide away from the raid. And then you look up, the airplane would come and they have this red sun on the belly of the Japanese planes. That's when you hide, right? Yeah. And then within like 5 minutes, more planes come again. They look up, it's the shark. And whenever they see the shark, they felt safer. It was one of those. Yeah, it's one of these stories that live orally among people in Yunnan. So thank you.
In Yunnan, no, but not Yunnan, in Xinjiang, there's a professional basketball team that call themselves the Flying Tigers. And they call the Flying Tiger name and so on comes up constantly in contemporary Chinese small videos and big videos and so on. It really has become a very powerful symbol of US-China collaboration.
Yeah. And on collaboration, we have a question in the chat from Lucy, and it says, how come only Americans and British were involved in these crucial effort? Who was the international organization that was orchestrating these?
Well, that's a fascinatingly topical question because I think the questioner is assuming that there was something like the United Nations operating in 1940. But of course, there wasn't.
Yeah.
It was Britain and America at war in Europe against the Nazis in Germany and against Japan in Asia. Of course, Britain had the Commonwealth as its allies, and there were New Zealanders and Australians and indeed Indians who were much involved in the Hump operation. But there was no international organization, and it was because of World War II that America helped set up the United Nations to prevent another war. And it's a very topical issue right now if you read the news. I don't know whether that answers your question.
If I might add a footnote, yeah, I think that's a really brilliant question, Lucy, actually, because in terms of there weren't really multilateral organizations, as Alan pointed out, but of course, you know, there was a high level of military organization, both in Britain and in the US. And so, in fact, there was still a bit of an international effort, because the Flying Tigers, for example, which did start out, as Alan pointed out, as a mercenary organization, they attracted different nationalities, and but they were flying under, you know, as you know, as this group that called themselves the Flying Tigers. Actually, they were under the Chinese Air Force. So it was the Chinese Air Force with an American-led unit that was, you know, basically all kinds of people, you know, including some Chinese who were hired, who were trained by the Americans. But recently on my social media, some people who I don't actually, I've never met in person, but they follow me, and they started a conversation about a Polish Flying Tiger. There was indeed a Polish guy who joined the Flying Tigers, and they're very proud of him. And I forgot his name now, but so just like that, of course, in the Hump, there were, as Alan said, there would have been Indians, there would have been Burmese, and one of the eye-opening moments for me when I was researching the Flying Tigers in Yunnan, Mei's home stamping grounds, is a persistent rumor near the border of Burma and Yunnan that a bunch of local people from British India, so they would have been Indians, you know, they would have been places like Assam, they would have been Burmese, they might even have been Nepalese, had been conscripted by the Japanese, brought to a border city called Tengchong, which is on our itinerary for the WildChina tour, and forced to build a remarkable underground bunker that went down 3 levels under a mountain with all kinds of trenches and you know, like underground dormitories and canteens. And it was a remarkable thing. Took a lot of effort to build. It was structurally very impressive, because the Japanese military had actually hired a Japanese mining company, which is very experienced in that sort of underground excavation, to actually build the structure. And they conscripted this labor from the British controlled colonial territories, and it was built. And then the persistent rumor that I heard, that I've been trying to pin down, is that for reasons of secrecy, the Japanese did not want these laborers to start talking to anybody about what they had built for the Japanese. So there was of undetermined size, but a massacre of these laborers and a mass grave somewhere near the border with Burma. Again, it's a rumor that I've heard from many locals, but so far it's unsubstantiated. But it just shows you how international this effort was. And still, even today, in Burma, the local government has been coming up with, they actually repatriated remains of Chinese soldiers who had been fighting the war effort in Burma and had been killed there or trapped there. There was famously a group that has been nicknamed the Lost Battalion, because they got stuck in Burma. They couldn't get back to Yunnan. And so they said, okay, the only other option is to go to India, to Assam, a part of India. And so they started out they didn't get there. And a few years ago, in a primary school playground in Burma, it was discovered that there was a graveyard for some of these members of the Lost Battalion, and their remains were repatriated to China. They just never got home. They were trying to go through deep jungle, disease, all kinds of insects, all kinds of animals, and also indigenous tribes which were quite aggressive, and at least one of the tribes were cannibals. So nobody made it to the other side.
Wow, yeah, those stories. In the chat, there's Eating sent a comment. There were several hundred Russian pilots, yeah, and about Russian 2,000 ground personnel also flew in China from 1938 to 1949. That period of history is just, amazing. The kind of international resistance, collaboration, the courage, amazing. So since you mentioned Tengchong, Melinda, maybe this is a good chance to talk a little bit about the trips that are planned. Surely,
Yes.
if you have any flyer that you can show the routing, but Melinda, tell us, you and Alan are the brain trust behind it.
Okay. Well, the Doolittle Raiders is one itinerary, and I think because there was a lot of footage taken on site during the presentation. Some of those places you're now somewhat familiar with, but what I think is going to be equally exciting and more, shall we say, more remote or more rugged, perhaps, is the Western China itinerary. And I've always loved Yunnan. You know me, Mei. We've been there before together, walking around in the hills. Now, Yunnan is fascinating today. Why this is a great tour for people to go on today is that for many years, that front, meaning, I suppose Westerners would call it the Western Front. In military jargon, it's called the China-Burma India Theater, or CBI Theater. It's sort of neglected because it is very remote. The eastern part of China was more populated by Westerners and foreigners and missionaries and journalists who could document what was going on. So we know a fair bit about the Battle of Shanghai, which is on our itinerary, where 800 Chinese soldiers made a last stand and basically sacrificed themselves against the Japanese. The Doolittle Raiders you've heard about. That also some Nanjing massacre everyone knows about, but in Western China, equally dramatic things were taking place, but I think media saturation plus a lack of reporters, plus maybe war fatigue on all fronts. Lots of stuff was happening during those years, and so at the time, some of those dramatic events in Yunnan and in Chongqing, even the wartime capital, were not well covered, and today we're not actually that well understood. Now, why should this be? Well, yeah, one reason why what was going on in Yunnan was not that well promoted, I think even within China, is because it was a sort of it was a kind of its own, it had its own personality as a war front. It was very international. Basically there was a Chinese warlord in charge of the province. He was very charismatic. He was very innovative and very intelligent, and he got along well with the Americans. He got along with the British, but he was kind of doing his own thing. He got along with the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, and he also got along with the communists. And in the end, he was called a Red Warlord because he joined with the communists. And so he was what was going on in Yunnan was kind of seen as something unusual. One reason why it was unusual is because there was something called a China Expeditionary Force. Now, if you're in the military, you'll know that an expeditionary force goes outside of its normal borders to, to engage in military actions outside of its home turf. And so these were the Chinese who some of them did get stuck in Burma. Some of them saved British soldiers in Burma. Maggie Thatcher honored one of the Chinese generals, but there they were mostly Chinese nationalist soldiers, Kuomintang soldiers. And for a period of time, their achievements were not very high profile, were not reported that much. And indeed, I've met a couple of former Kuomintang war veterans at the time who had not been recognized as, real military men. So they didn't get a pension. They didn't, Then in 2017, they were recognized. So that shows you how recently some of this stuff is happening. The former Chinese nationalist soldiers who fought against the Japanese were recognized as legitimate military veterans, so long as they did not also fight against the communists. And they were given back pay and pensions, and they were thrilled. They were like 90-something years old, and they were really happy when I saw them. This was a number of years ago. The other thing that's happening is, since that time, people started paying attention to the old battlefields. Again, these would have been just left to ruin, let them molder away, the buildings destroyed, the trenches just overgrown. And now one of the highlights of the tour to Yunnan will be a trench warfare battlefield that is extremely well preserved now. It's in a beautiful, forested area with, wooden platforms, so you can walkways, so you can walk on flat surfaces and see all kinds of rugged things around you, but it's comfortable to walk on. I've been there in various seasons. It's beautiful. As you know, Yunnan weather is great. And it had literally opened to the public in a major way only during the pandemic. So there are no one was going anywhere during the pandemic in China. So there were very few visitors of any sort who've been there recently. And I brought a historian from America, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And when he went through there, he was mind-boggled. He said it was one of the best preserved trench warfare battlegrounds he'd ever seen. And he'd been all over Europe as well. So this is a real highlight. And it's not very well visited. And certainly, I would imagine 99% of the people who do go on the tour to go there will be seeing it for the first time. And the 1% would be Alan and me, probably.
Amazing. I can listen to you talk about this for a long time, and our audience is engaging as well. Some commenting on the Hump or the Flying Tigers relationship to the founding of the Cathay Pacific. I mean, we need another hour, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and probably wrap it here. And anyone interested in discussing more, hearing more, learning more about this incredible history, please come join us. Shirley has put in the chat some flyers about these two trips, and also you can find them on wildchina.com. Both Melinda and Alan will personally be there, so you literally will experience that emotions, how they connect to this history. So thank you, Melinda, thank you, Alan, for your time and insight, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join us. Hope to see you all again at another Wild China event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mei.
Thank you.
Come join us.
See you on the trip.
It's so exciting.
See you on the trip. All 35 of you.
See you on the trip, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thank you, Shirley and Yiming, the WildChina crew. Amazing job.